able to go back to this and rewatch it if you would like that sort of torture. So we're going to get started. I'm going to kind of briefly talk about some of my tools. Since I travel so much, I've kind of locked down sort of the tools that I use and minimal tools that I need and bring, and I'll talk about that. The minimum amount of tools that I typically travel with and work with are basically they fall into four little categories, 4 brushes. I have a larger round. I have a few different sizes, but basically a large round brush, smaller brush for some details, right? And both of those are nice, simple round brushes. And then I usually travel with 2 flat brushes, one bit larger for larger areas and washes, and a smaller one for maybe some details and things like that. This is about a 1/4, 3/8 half flat brush, and this is about maybe an inch. For me, that's pretty big. I typically work 10 by 14, 15 by 20. I have most of those pieces off to the right there that we see are kind of 15 by 20 range, maybe 18 by 24. But that's usually the limit of of the sizes that I work with watercolor. Brushes, in terms of expensive and cheap, these calligraphy brushes, these Asian calligraphy brushes are great. They're meant, and I stumbled upon them just a few years ago. I've always thought they were meant for like inks and calligraphy and stuff like that, but I found out they work very well for watercolor, and they're also very cheap. They're meant to hold a lot of ink, and so in this case, water and wash. And they also are good at coming to a fine point when they are wet. So they hit on a lot of those little categories that you need for a good watercolor brush. The one drawback for these is they will break down. So they break down relatively quick. You can get some good quality ones and it'll last a little bit longer, but you kind of do have to get used to maybe a stray hair in your wash every once in a while, and buying them in bulk. But they are great, and they're a great starter little brush. The more traditional European ones seem to last a little bit longer, but the value that you get while you're spending money on a good watercolor brush is basically about the amount of wash or color and liquid that a brush can hold, right? The more often you go back to your little puddle of color, the more often the color will shift on you. So if you're looking to get some clean washes, right, or you're worried about like your painting is getting muddy or things like that, a large, good watercolor brush will prevent you from having to keep going back and forth. And that also will prevent you from kind of manipulating the wash before it dries and having lots of little brush strokes, because you constantly have to wet your brush. One of the first things, if you're going to be working in large areas, use large brushes. Don't try to use a small brush to fill in large areas. You'll just keep manipulating the puddle of the wash of color on the paper, and you'll get all these random textures that you don't want, and depends on what you're really going for. So for brushes, that's kind of what I kind of recommend. I do travel with, as an artist, you just start collecting them. But in general, give me 4 brushes and I'm pretty solid with what I can create. To me, the most important part of my tool set is the paper, right? Get good quality watercolor, cotton watercolor paper. Okay? I cannot stress. If I had $20, I would spend $16 on paper, right? It is a little expensive to get the good stuff. Get the stuff that you feel that you can mess up on. Maintain a certain quality, like don't get the stuff that says mixed media. make sure it says watercolor, and in general, you'll be pretty good and fine. But stick with the same paper and don't, and my biggest little nudge for beginning artists is artists that say like, oh, I'll save the good paper until when I'm ready. You will never be ready, right? So get the paper that you're comfortable using, because you learn about all the little nuances, how long it takes to dry, how far that paint spreads, how much you can manipulate, how much you can lift. All of these little lessons of watercolor that get you used to it, if you consistently switch paper or use cheap paper, those lessons become a lot harder. And that was something that took me a while, because when I first started, I just got the cheap stuff, right? And finally one day I'm like, okay, I made some money at a show, I'm gonna buy some good stuff, and I've stuck with them ever since. My go-to, my standard default is Arches. And if I use these watercolor blocks mostly because I travel. And what that means is that they are sealed on all four sides except for a little area here. So that way you don't need to tape it down, okay? But it's a little bit more expensive that way. You can get loose paper, and it's a little cheaper for the same quality of paper. But I will tell you a quick little secret. If you're worried about your paper buckling, if you're using good quality watercolor paper, right, it's cotton. So you can take an iron on low heat, spritz the back of it, and iron it flat. Trust me, it works. I know it's a little scary to iron your art, but there are pieces, when I have some of those pieces that I have off to the right that you can look at later, when I finished it, they were still a little wrinkled and wavy. Turn it over, iron it flat on the back. Good, right? You spritz a little water on the back, kind of a thing. So good cotton watercolor paper, you can really do some damage with it and have fun with it. So brushes, watercolor paper. This is my travel palette. I have a much larger kind of ceramic palette at the studio. Paints are important. If you're going to be sticking with watercolor for a short amount of time, a few months at least, it's better to get the good artist quality watercolors. It seriously will last you a long time. One of those tubes, right, can last me a year or two, and I paint a lot, right? So you get a tube. I know it feels expensive sometimes for the tube versus getting sometimes like the cheaper palettes, but the amount of pigment and the amount of ease of rewetting for the really higher quality paints will make your artist's life a lot easier, right? I primarily use a brand called M. Graham, like graham cracker. And they are located in the Portland, Pacific Northwest area. And what makes them very unique and very interesting and fun to work with is they use honey in their formulation for the paints. They put a little bit of, I think it's blackberry honey or something. And what that does, honey is known as scientifically a humectant, right? Your honey that you have in your cupboards that stays tacky for an incredibly long time. Right? So it absorbs moisture from the air a little bit. And what it does to your paints is that there are colors that I have here that will stay tacky, and it won't harden up the pebbles. If you're a watercolorist and you've done this before, or you're a casual watercolorist, you'll have your palette in the corner in that closet, and then you'll come back a few months later, open it up, and it's a bunch of rocks, right? I haven't touched this travel palette in about a month because I haven't gone around, and there are no rocks in here. And in fact, some of them, if you touch them a little bit, you can still press down on it a little, right? What that means for your arts, though, not just like a cool little convenience of life here. When you have these pebbles, it takes a bit of scrubbing and water to like reactivate the pigment and the watercolor, but because M. Graham uses honey and it's still a little tacky, it takes less water to reactivate it Less water means higher pigmentation or higher saturation of colors. Means it's much easier to get the reds redder, the blues bluer, and the greens greener, right? Because I don't have to like load these little pellets up with water to reactivate it. So M-Gram, or there's another brand I think called Sennelier that uses honey. Those are in general the brands I skew towards. There are some fun colors out there that I've gotten from Winsor Newton and Daniel Smith, and there's so many. But all you need is really a few core colors, and we're good. And then water. Water is going to be it sounds weird to speak of it, but water is going to be the cheapest art supply you will ever have, right? So if it gets dirty, replace it. In fact, get a lot of it. When I travel, I have these nice little like doggy bowls here that are collapsible and everything else. But I work with a little bit larger one, or I usually have one that's dirty and clean water or whatever else, or I just easily go and clean it out. If you're online and you see these cute little setups and stuff like that, people are painting with like a teacup and they set everything up and it looks really cute. Not functional. Just use water. Have an ample amount of water, and it will help you out instead of trying to muddy your painting. Because one of the common comments with watercolor is that everything I paint turns to mud, right? And that's one of the reasons, because you're working with muddy, dirty water. So water, paints, brushes, paper. It's deceptively simple for watercolor, right? So what I'm going to do now is kind of go through some very simple exercises and approaches to watercolor. Everything from simple washes, graded washes, things like that, but just how I set things up. Okay. This is actually for a laptop, but in general, I work on an angle, right? If I want to get flat washes. If I want to get textures and like salt washes and get a lot of those little textures that are really renowned with the watercolor medium, I will lay it down flat. So if you want to kind of be a little bit more control and not leave, the watercolor up to the watercolor gods, those textures, I suggest just working at a little bit of an angle, and I'll show you why shortly.
I have a quick question. Do you have an example that you could show us that is like something you've done in texture?
Yeah. Let me see if I have anything. I don't often work. I'll put this here for a second. Hold on. There you go. All right. So when I talk about textures, and I'll try to hold this up real quickly, it's whenever you let a puddle just dry on its own, and it has these little edge textures along the way, right? Versus getting the details. So this one has. You'll see a lot of like sort of puddles that I've just let dry, things like over here. In general, though, I am slightly more controlled with my watercolors to get some of the details that I do get. But I can show you more. You can come up later to take a look at some of this stuff, or I can point them out off to the right with some of my other artwork. All right. We'll use this. This is a common exercise that I still do whenever I get a new color, right? M-Gram just put out 2 new colors earlier this year. One was quinacridone rose and one was an indigo of some sort. But I had a lot of issues in the beginning controlling my color and understanding how things blended together, as well as trying to understand how things mixed, right? And making a lot of mud with my colors, because it's so easy for watercolor to accidentally blend with another color. You're working in layers, you're generally working from light to dark. So what I'm going to do is load up. I'm going to have this nice big puddle here. I'll put this here, I'll hold it a little bit. Use this red. And what I'm going to do is just create a little bit of this rectangular wash here. And try not to, right? And as I go back and forth, right, you notice I'm going to kind of wiggle my brush a little bit. But I'm going to work top to bottom, and there's a little bit of a wet bubble that falls and drips lower until I get to the very end, and I'm going to kind of go straight across. Actually, there is one thing that I did forget. Is there a napkin here at all? Or tissue? Yeah, if you can. That's the other thing I forgot. Have some napkins or towels with you.
There's some right there.
Oh, never mind. Yeah, that's fine. This works. So when I wiggled my brush across, just to kind of, is everyone looking at a phone or something like that? See, okay. So as I'm wiggling my brush slightly across.
There's a delay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. You'll notice that, and that is done so that our eyes are really good at seeing straight lines, right? Connecting dots and things like that to like make sure. So sometimes even the best of us, the perfect washes will have some weird textures that'll come up, and if I'm wiggling my brush ever so slightly, it prevents having a perfectly straight line kind of coming across, because that sticks out in nature, right? If I'm out in the woods in the forest or out in the landscape and I see a perfectly straight line, it's like, whoa, that stands out. So by wiggling my brush over large washes like that, it kind of, even if it leaves a little bit of a mark, it'll kind of blend in hopefully after a couple layers. So that's a nice little minor trick. And I should have made a bigger wash. I'm going to try to use the same pigment here. What I'm going to do is start this again at a slightly lower level and move my way across and kind of go down again. What's going to happen is this little area is going to get darker or more saturated, right? And this is just good exercise to try to understand, hey, how far can I go with a single brush, right, without having to re-wet it, right? It'll give you that good idea. It'll also give you an idea of how many washes does it take in general to be comfortable to get to a more saturated color, right? And I will just create these little layers to see how dark I can get with a relatively light wash over here, okay? And I would consider this little puddle of color in my palette here to be kind of like tea right now, right? We're looking at various levels of watercolor washes. It's like start with like tea, and then you get into like kind of milk, and then you can just go directly into like paste by pulling directly from the well itself. But so right now we're working with a tea level consistency of pigment and color, right? And to kind of give us an idea, at the end, we might end up with something like this, right? I'm just going to kind of go, in this case, kind of like this. I am just going to go over and over and over and over again, doing smaller and smaller rectangles until I get a very consistently kind of dark, saturated bar across this, right? And we'll do one more, then I'll come back later. I'll put this aside. Normally I would give it a little bit more time to wait and dry, but for the sake of this demo, I'm just gonna wash, right? And again, this will help you gain a little bit of control, understand how much water your brush can hold, and how long it takes for things to dry, and so on and so forth. Okay. The best way to prevent, and I'm going to switch to this thing right now.
I think they use one.
Oh, okay. I'm going to switch to this guy here. This is a quinacridone rose. This is one of M. Graham's newer colors. But what I'm going to do now is basically rotate it 90 degrees. Okay? And I'm going to do the same thing with a different color. Okay? And since watercolor is done with layers, right? This is going to give us an idea of all the different colors I can get with basically two colors. So I'm going to start a little bit lower here. I'm just going to do kind of the same thing, create my edges, and then just kind of go back and forth, wetting it as we kind of make my way down. I'm going to go a little bit past it so I can see the color, right? Yeah, so this is a little, believe this is my either Prussian or Prussian level of blue, cyan or something like that. But I'm going to do a very light wash over it. And I can see what's happening now is all the different levels of color that I can get with just one light blue wash over this series of gradually darkening washes, right? So that's right up here. Okay. And we can let that dry as well. But I can now do a few of these, and let's say I want, okay, now I know how pink works, how this quinacridone rose works with this blue. Let me get a nice warm yellow on this, and let me do it on the next one over. All right. Now I'm going to move across. I'm going to extend a little bit down so I can see that it is a yellow. And what I can see with the yellow, that'll give me some fun things, is that some of these hit pretty close to various skin tones now, right? With just a single light wash of yellow and in this rose, right? And we can continually go back and forth over them again and again and again, right? So get that kind of a Prussian, and we'll go back in over, start a little bit lower, right? As we start doing this. And what you'll end up with is this nice little grid of and an understanding of what this, in this case it's an anthraquinone blue with there's a green and a pink and a red and a blue and a yellow, and you'll get a slow understanding of how many values or how careful you need to be with certain colors. This one, our anthraquinone blue, is a very powerful dark blue. So it definitely is a color that I use near the end of my painting if I'd ever need to get somewhere dark, because you can always get darker in value in watercolors. It's much more difficult to brighten those up. There are some techniques with that, but in general, we want to be a little careful with it. Okay? But this was something I started to play around with the new color that I got, and I figured this will be a good one to kind of show my process of getting used to that, right? And in the beginning, if you're getting started with watercolor, start with fewer colors. Keep it simple so that you understand how those colors interact, and it kind of helps us minimize the amount of mud that we'll create. I'll do one more so that we can blend it off later. And I'll leave these up here so that you can kind of take a look. All right. The important thing to also realize with colors, and then we're going to get into a little color theory as well, is especially in watercolors, maybe less so with some of the more opaque pigments out there with acrylics and oils. But be aware when your pigments are not single pigment colors. Most 90% of my pigments are single pigment colors, meaning that there's only one pigment that makes that color. That's generally the rule as well that I appreciate M-Gram for. They don't have a whole wide variety of colors. They have a very small, concentrated set of colors that have maybe one, maybe two pigments, right? This is important with watercolors because then you'll sometimes get separation if you get some fancier, cooler colors. Some colors have 3 pigments on the outside of 4. And with watercolors, when you're mixing a 3-pigment color with another 2-pigment color, things happen that are unexpected because you have a red and a green and a dark purple in one color, and then orange and a yellow in another. And all of those colors are actually mixing together with watercolor, right? Because you're giving them that sort of substrate with this wet puddle to like blend in. And so when I do hear people kind of say like, oh, I kind of mixes colors, I don't understand color theory, watercolor does make it a little bit more difficult because it allows all those multi-pigment colors to blend. So you have to be a little bit more aware when it comes to that, which is why in general, I make my life easier and I stick to mostly single pigment colors. Okay? All right, I'm going to do a graded wash. Okay, so I'm going to use this blue for a second. And I'm going to do kind of the same thing that I did here with this rectangle. I'm just going to do one next to it for a second. Start the same way. Except in this case, instead of going back and getting more pigment, I'm going to kind of dip my brush into the clean water a little bit. And then slowly kind of continue doing the same thing, wiggling my brush, and eventually this should be pretty clean water right now, and moving it down, right? So I'm slowly doing the exact same process there, but instead, every so often, just washing a bit more of my pigment off, and now I'm able to control and get a nice soft wash for that. Okay, and it's called a graded wash, and doing washes like this helps when you're at an angle because you're letting gravity kind of pull things down and drip down for you. It's doing a lot of the work. Doing this flat, you might end up getting a little bit more texture in there. Okay, but this will give you a lot more control when you're working at an angle here. Okay. We're going to let that dry for a second. Are there any questions, real quick? Yeah? All right.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you're saying like you don't use orange, you make orange, you overlap your yellow over your red. Is that what you're saying?
That is a way we can do it. We'll talk about like sort of some of the color theory. I do have an orange on my palette. It's basically, but it's just one. I have a lot of reds. I have a bunch of yellows. There is one orange. I have a lot of blues. There is a couple greens. right? And then just a bunch of value colors. So if we're looking at what I am generally doing, yes, I mix a lot more greens and oranges and violets than actually pulling them off of my palette directly. But that isn't to say, like this, my palette in my studio, I do have a lot of what I call like convenience colors, right? They just make life a little easier sometimes, or if you want to be more consistent. All right, so hopefully this is dry a little bit. As I was mentioning, gradients, they work with the angle that you're working at. So oftentimes, if you ever look at some of my speed paints, you'll see me tilt and angle my paper. But we're going to do one the other way for a second. And I'm going to do a yellow. And I'm going to go in the other direction, right? I'm going to start there. All right, so go that, wash it off a little bit. And I'm just going to help this little puddle of water work its way down till I get to the very end. Try my brush and pick up. Your brush can also act as a little bit of a sponge, and so you can just literally pick up that end down there, right? And so in this scenario, I took blue, and it was at the top a darker blue, and I faded it down and graded wash. I flipped my page over, and I did a yellow, and I faded it down. And since they're overlapping and since that blue was dry, I now have a very controlled gradient from blue to yellow, right? I'm not leaving that up to the watercolor fates and gods. They're like, okay, I'm gonna put some yellow here, I'm gonna put some blue here, and then let's draw like a little puddle and let them mix, right? I was actually able to control. If I wanna be a little, if I wanna shift that middle higher to where the midpoint is, I can do that now, right? I can just get used to it and control how much water I'm adding to my graded wash or how far down I'm doing it. But this allows me, this sort of technique right here, if you look at some of my artwork, there's a lot of colors going on. I'm just doing this on smaller and smaller scales to get the details that I need, right? If I need to get that gradient from this blue to that orange, I'm gonna do a graded wash of the blue, right? Wait for that to dry, turn it around, and do a graded wash of orange. I don't know how that'll blend together, but basically I'll have a fading orange over a fading blue and let color theory figure out what's going to happen there. But this is a good technique to kind of get control back from watercolor. Watercolor can be very chaotic, and we want to be able to assert our control whenever we can, right? And so, again, we can do a series of graded washes this way to really level it up, and then a series of graded washes in another angle. Possibilities are endless, but this was something this was a sort of a process that I stumbled across that really helped me control how I was approaching a lot of the colors, pieces that had a lot of colors, right? When I first started with watercolors and painting, there were two big lessons that I had to kind of get and learn. One was patience, right? You gotta sometimes just wait for things to dry. And that's why I have a whole bunch of different pieces that might be half done at the same time. But be patient. Let them dry so that you can work over on top of them. And the other one was a little bit of, you gotta cross your fingers. Sometimes you have to have faith. Right? Hopefully doing some of these setups and doing some of these exercises in the beginning, I have a little bit more faith on how things should turn out, and we're not just testing it out on the final artwork, right? watercolor is seen as one of the most difficult mediums, not necessarily because of the water, is because it's transparent, right? You make a mistake with it, you can't just white it out again, right? You can't just cover it up or cover over it. If you're doing a portrait and the eyes shifted a little bit on you, you can fix it with oil paintings and acrylics and things like that, or even gouache. But with watercolor, it's all in the prepping and the planning before you start. For all these big pieces that I have off to the side there were probably about, I will come and show you, but
While you're talking.
sure. There are small pencil sketches, there are color studies, there are digital elements that I've fleshed out before I even put paint to paper.
So like on this one,
Yeah.
this looks like you might have a lot of is that digital?
No, that's all paint.
This is all paint.
Yeah, so that's all watercolor right there. All right. But there were other smaller pieces that I've done before this big one, of the hair, of the drawing, to make sure everything is down. Right? Yeah, so I think on that one that you're looking at, in the back, there should be some other pieces of art. Yeah, so you can see some of the color studies on the back. So they're smaller, and I'm in a more of a mental state of, oh, let me try these colors, let me test these out, let me figure out how the lighting is going to work.
Did you do it on first?
I did that one first before I worked on the final. So by the time I'm working on the final, I know where my lighting is coming from. I know that the drawing underneath is sound, right? I get a lot of people at these shows that I go to that ask me what are some things I can do to get my watercolors better? And one of the first things I always say is get your drawings to a point where you are confident, right? That doesn't have to be anatomically perfect. That's a completely different thing, right? For me, but make sure your drawing is confident so that you're not, when you're painting, when I am in the painting process, I'm only focused on putting color where it's supposed to be.
Is this ink in here, down in here?
Nope.
Is that all? That's all?
100% watercolor.
All watercolor.
Yeah, I might have gone in really hard with like a Payne's gray or a lamp black.
Very small in detail.
Yeah,
That's why I know.
yeah, but those big ones there are all watercolor.
You ever use a fan to kind of speed up the process a little bit, or
Yeah.
a little bit of heat with it? Or?
Yeah. One of the things you often see is people pulling out like a little hair dryer, right, to dry it. I used to in the beginning, but I slowly stopped, right? For instance, in this little blue-yellow gradient here, right, that I'm talking about, at one point it was a lot damp and I could have dried it, okay? And what you're doing when you're drying is you're fixing those pigments exactly where they are. So you're locking them in. And to me, one of the beautiful things about watercolor is a little bit of that like unknown what's going to happen, but letting those colors blend. Watercolor, you get these gradients that I think are much more delicate than you can in like oil, or it takes a lot more work than in oil paintings and acrylics, right? If I'm going to do a gradient, I need to figure out all the little steps of that gradient and pre-mix a lot of things. So I try not to use a hair dryer or a fan to fix all the pigments. I want to give them the time that they have to kind of slowly blend and to do the things that watercolor does. So yeah. So
So does this one have ink then?
no, honestly,
This little black?
it was probably that one. I do have some that have ink, but that one is
Trying to find one.
yeah. most of my stuff does not have ink on them, believe it or not. When I first started with watercolor, and I made the decision that I wanted to do more watercolor, I actually threw away a lot of my ink pens. I was like, I don't want to have these around. I'm going to either toss them in the far back of my closet when I had the nice ones, but all my other cheap little pens, I'm tossing them away. Not going to have that taunt me to try to create edges. But that does lead me, that little conversation about pens leads me into how do we create edges, right? And that's a very difficult and challenging thing sometimes with watercolor, right? Because we can use temperature, we can use little color theory to create differences and contrasts and saturation to bring things forward or back. But how do we, I'm going to open up this is also more water. How do we create an edge? I'm going to use two brushes for this. I'm going to use a thin, skinny brush. Let me see what I have here. This one works. And I have a little bit larger brush. And just load that with some clean water. All right, I'll put that here. So there's two ways that we can either get the paper wet first, or we can kind of control it a bit. But we're going to do two different ways to create an edge. Let's use a purple. We'll use a purple. Let's see. So I'm going to do a straight line down. And then really quickly come with my other brush that has clean water and paint right up next to it. Right? And that's going to allow you to create an edge. And the faster you kind of do this, the more you'll wash and pull it out, right? So if I just real quickly I'm going to do another one next to it here. And put some clean water next to it. And what that's going to do is going to do two things with this sort of osmosis and gradient and physics of this. You're going to have water, you're going to provide a sort of a medium for that pigment to go from high concentration to low concentration, right? But what's also going to happen, because they're getting so close to the edge that you created with a thin brush, is that you're going to get some of that water that pushes that pigment into that edge, right? And so you're going to get this highly saturated sort of effect, okay? And right, just to kind of continue this on the other side. This is a fun little. But it'll soften it up, so it'll give a bit of space to that to that saturated area or to that edge, and it won't feel like you've just taken a pen and just drawn a line, but it'll help you do that. And we can. I'm going to dry some of this edge down here, right? And this is very a couple lines and you got a lightsaber, right? But you can get a lot of those edges. The other way is to put clean water first, and sometimes that's kind of difficult because it's hard to tell where your watered edge is, but you can also put down some clean water. It's sometimes kind of hard to see. The rest of your page must be pretty dry. And then I'm going to go back in with, kind of flip it around, go the other way, Um, let's use this orange. And I think that's the edge. Kind of have to tell. Right? But we're able to, again, kind of push and pull up to that point. We're using water to kind of act as a layer to prevent that pigment from getting into the dry paper. So this is sometimes where you need that patience. You want to get that edge, you know, we're going to plan ahead and make sure that the rest of the area is dry, and then we can play around with it. Also, it's fun to just kind of sometimes break up a little bit of this before it dries too, so we can have it fading in and out. Right?
So you said the planning takes a lot of time? And
It can.
the drawing.
Yeah.
So how much time, for example, one of your, I guess the more complicated it is, the more, but do you finish it all in one sitting?
No.
Oh.
Those large, I have pieces that I do finish in one sitting. I can do something in maybe 45 minutes that I'm happy with. A little simpler and basic, but we can do this. One of the things I do when I for some of the shows, I do live art events for the fans. And one of them is called Comic Explosion. And I have an hour and basically they have 6 artists. Each of us has an easel and a big 16 by 24, 18 by 24 panel, and we have an hour. And so I've made some fun pieces within that hour. You're working really fast, you're making decisions really quick, and you're just going with it. But I can do something within that I'm content with and happy with. For these pieces, these are from Marvel, and since they're for publishing, I give myself minimum of a week for the process, right? That means sketching it out. Once I have a pose, I am not really changing the pose while I am painting, right? When I'm painting, and this is the biggest challenge for me when I was learning, was like, okay, when I'm painting, I'm just painting. I'm painting what's there. I am not trying to figure out my piece. I am not changing my mind too much about where the lighting is coming from, right? Once I have that idea, it's kind of there. Some mediums, you're allowed to make some creative changes during the process, right? But for a lot of it, for watercolor, the best advice I can give is to separate those creative milestones. Hey, I'm in the sketching phase, I'm trying to figure it out. I like this sketch, let me test what colors work on it, do something small, right? So that your time investment isn't crazy. But what that does and what that mental state does for me is that I'm in let me try this color. Oh yeah, that's how this color blends with this. Okay, yeah. And I'm a lot more freer at that point. That's kind of the fun watercolors, right? We're like, oh, let's try this color. Oh, let's do this. But I'll have a couple different variants maybe until I lock down sort of the pigments or the colors that I'm going to use. And then I transfer it and work on the final piece to get all the details and things like that.
So in that one week, the painting process takes how much time?
The painting process probably takes anywhere from, for those size, I give myself probably like 40% of the time, 50% of the time. Half the time is probably, one day is mostly sketching, right? Concepting. The second 2 are refining it, making sure, for me, is my anatomy correct? Can I find some references that are gonna help me with this? Are there do I want to change the angle on him a little bit here and there to make it more dynamic on a figure? But there's the minor manipulation once I have my thumbnail down. And then at some point I go, okay, this is what I want. I know where I'm going to go. The exact path to get there while I'm painting, there's some changes, minor ones along the way, but for the most part, 80-90% locked down on the process.
I
do you get your image on the paper? Do you sketch it small to begin with, and then freehand draw it? Do you project it? How do you do it?
For these big ones, I do have a projector. Sometimes I'll just freehand drawing it for some of these like medium-sized ones, I guess, where I'll do like a quick little thumbnail. I don't know if I have. Oftentimes I like to. Yeah. So these are sometimes like my. Here you go. These are my little thumbnails and sketches sometimes when I'm trying to figure things out, right?
So you just
Yeah, so it's in there trying to figure out like what I'm doing. And then sometimes it's straightforward enough that I'll just transfer it. There are two ways for when I'm doing things for publishing that I will transfer. One, I will project, because some of these are on boards. And the other is I actually do have a nice, if I've done some digital concept work, I do have a nice printer, and I print at like 7% the line work. I'll finalize the line work, and I'll print onto the paper at 7%. So two of these, over like probably a couple of them, are actually printed on, and some of them are actually projected on, right? And you can't see. After a couple layers, you just can't see. I just need enough to make sure that my landmarks for my painting are solid. When I am painting, so let's do a quick demo. My drawings used to be a lot more detailed, okay? I used to do a lot of pen and ink work before I started watercolor. Pen and ink work, lots of line, lots of cross-hatching, right? Lots of filling in the black areas and things like that, finding your shadows. But what I've found as I started, okay, this is for my comic. I'll do a little bit here. Yeah.
So, after you paint on top of this, you've got your watercolor in there, you can see the drawing underneath. Do you then use an eraser to erase an eraser?
Yes. So I'm about to go over that right now.
Oh, sorry.
No. Great segue. I'm going in the right direction with you. I use kneaded erasers, right? I don't. The two things that I use. I have a 2mm pencil. Okay. I used to use mechanical pencils, and they're tiny and thin and stuff like that. Occasionally they dig into the paper, and if you worked with watercolor, if you have a scratch in the paper, the pigment actually falls into it and it creates a line, right? And in fact, that is a technique I can show you as well if you want to create an edge. But I rarely ever sharpen this pencil. I don't need it to have all those little details, and so it's relatively non-sharp edge of a pencil, and I'm able to just kind of draw as I need it. And secondly, I use a kneaded eraser, and I often don't scrub. I roll it up like a rolling pin, and I roll it over. Right? And what that'll do is that'll just pick up all the loose leads, all the loose graphite. And, this was all the same sort of darkness. I draw light anyways, but you can see that I've lifted up quite a bit. It's a lot lighter here, right? This corner, a lot lighter. But there's just enough for me to be able to identify the edges. Okay? And that's all I need. In my head, I know where the shadows are going to go, right? I know the direction of the light and everything else. I just need a few shapes and lines to help me remember.
So you do that before you paint?
Before I paint.
Before you paint, okay.
All right? And then in this case, I will put down maybe a quick wash, and I'll right? And be able to come back to this in a little bit as well. But I am going to do the kind of the same thing, work top to bottom. And instead of a rectangular shape that I was doing there, I just kind of did a little bit of a round shape there, right? And that kind of gets me that. And I'm going to use blue here for his green helmet, which is kind of weird, but trust me, it's part of the process. And I'll talk about this in a second as well. Right? And that's probably my first wash for this, and I'm going to let this dry. Right? Seems very simple. It's just going to be a little face of an army guy. But we'll put that down. One more exercise I want to talk about. Oh, this works. We're going to get a little bit into color theory. Okay. Okay. All right, I am going to, let's get a little bit of a violet here. We all know the little ball exercise, right? Create a little ball, there's going to be a little specular highlight on that. There's going to be, it's going to sit on a plane, and then there's a cast shadow, right? And then there's this very sort of common exercise for us to do. And then we may think about, okay, I'm going to grab, I need to make the shadow a little bit more shadowy. I'm going to use this Payne's gray, for instance, and we're going to put it on this side here, and then the shadow has a little core shadow down here, and it's going to kind of look around. And then maybe a little bit later we get a little darker blue. We kind of put it there, right? And then maybe some light around it. Right? We might do something pretty straightforward. We've done this, we've tested this out before, right? I want to talk about it, approaching this with a slightly different thought process. One of the things that I've found, especially when you're working with trying to create scenes, right? Now you're not just trying to create an object, but you're thinking about something larger in scenes, is how do we might be painting something over a period of time. How do we keep things feeling cohesive within the scene, feeling like they're all feeling the same lighting and the shadows, and that they all seem like they belong in the scene and not just separate elements that we've stickered on, right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna kind of grab some purple. And one of the things that blend that out with a little bit of water here. And I'm going to choose a light source. I'll let this blend a bit here. Okay. I'm choosing two colors right now. One is a dioxazine violet, and the other is, I think, a gamboge. Basically, we have a warm light on a cool shadow. And one of the things, when I approach things that are more complex, is I keep it to almost just simply two colors, right? Pick a color for your light. We're all used to that. We see that often. But the other important part for me, and it was a big lesson, was picking a color for your shadow and being consistent in that, especially because watercolor works on layers and transparency. Those first couple washes in watercolor, very important to kind of keep it consistent, because those first colors will permeate through to the very end. In some small way or fashion, they will survive, right? I am not worried, right, in the beginning about what color my objects are, okay? I am worried about what the color of the light is and what's the color of my shadow. And usually those are going to be two contrasting elements. In this case, warm yellow and a cool purple, okay? And just like before with all of our little exercises, we can continue layering with these purples, and I can shift that purple. Maybe I do use a different pigment or so, but I can kind of come back in here with the same purple, and just like before, right? We're just gonna maybe darken that edge, and I'm gonna use all the little exercises that I did before. We put that purple there, get some clean water real quickly, give it a little medium or water to blend in on, let it, gravity help pull it down so I can get a nice gradient and all that fun stuff. With this, I'm trying to let this dry for a second here. Our highlights, right? That's where we get the most lighting effects for that, the tone for that. And then in the shadow, we have a lot of value, but we don't, the highest saturation, right, is in the midtones, right? So whatever the object's color is, so imagine you're walking around late at night, right? It's dark around the house, you want to turn on the lights, everything has this hue. But if something is red, right, and it's dark at night, everything, that red object with the bluish shadows or the purplish shadows that are going on is going to shift. We don't see that red, but that red is going to be kind of there in the mid-tone area where we have a little bit of light, and in the darkest areas we're not going to see it, and the brightest areas we're not. If we're out in the bright sunlight, the brightest areas where the sun is hitting something, it's going to be very light in that color, right? We're going to get a lot of white in the value in the range, and in the shadows it'll get darker. But it's in the midtones that we can change our, define, I should say, our color. So right now, our eyes are looking at this yellowish purple ball, and maybe we're assuming it's a light color ball, right? Maybe it's white because we're having a warm light over it and there's a shadow. It doesn't really have a color yet, but I can change that. And so let's say, I want it blue, or you can do it red or whatever else. I'm going to get some blue, and I'm going to put it right where this purple meets this yellow. I'm going to get some blue right where that purple meets this yellow. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before, get some clean water, let it blend on its edges a little bit. Right? And then what our eyes are going to slowly do, right? Is our eyes are going to kind of look at this, and our brain is going to go, oh, that's a blue ball with a yellow light and a purple shadow, right? But the object of it is blue. Right? And we can go through this process. Right? And I can do that same thing, but if I put green in that mid-tone, it's all of a sudden it's a green ball, right? If I make it very red in that middle area, it's all of a sudden it's a very dark red ball. I will take this and let's see if I can shift that. Let's use let's try to make it green. Right. I left the yellow, left some of the red on the other end, right? But I just kind of focus my green, that highest saturation in the middle here, and our eyes give that object a default color. Even though I didn't really, it's probably not the color that I've used the most in that object, right? It's just how our brains work. And so when I am approaching some pretty complex scenes, right, I stick, this is somewhat early on, this is mostly two colors. It's blue and it's pink, because the light in here is pink and the kind of purplish for the shadows, and her costume is going to be blue. But all I've focused on is primarily two colors, maybe a third in there, but primarily focus on what color is my light, what color is my shadow, and then I can shift that whatever needs to be in the middle later on, right? And so this is a great way to sort of break apart and think about color theory. And in watercolor, because it's transparent, so much of that work can be done for you by letting the water just kind of play and the pigments mix, right? All these fun little shades in here that are coming up between the blue and this green that are mixing, and the green and the yellow, all of that is just letting the pigments work their magic with the layers. Okay. So, right, and then so with something like this, since I use a light blue with that army helmet, this is where the shadow is, right? I'm gonna maybe come in with a little bit of a yellow on the edge, right? So it's kind of like slightly backlit to the right. And then I can come in with a little bit of a green just in that middle area. Between the blue and the yellow. And that's just enough for our eyes to kind of look at it and go like, oh, okay, yeah, I know this blue that we had in here is fine, but this is a green helmet, right? I have yellow and I have blue and there's a little bit of green, but our eyes see it, hey, it's a green helmet, right? And that's one of the little tricks I use to keep, when I have like larger scenes that I'm focusing on, especially for comics, keep things consistent. I just like, okay, let me just keep the same warm yellow tone in this scene, or if the scene has maybe it's a cool yellow light or a silvery moonish light, maybe it's a light blue light, right? I'm gonna use that as my light, and I'm gonna choose a different color as my shadow, and I'm gonna keep that consistent for my entire scene. And then all of the other colors, the objects, right? The green uniforms and the brown guns and the various other colors that might be in the scene will all seem to blend because they hold that bluish and yellowish shadow and light tones, right? How are we doing? Any questions? Is that helpful? Yeah? It is. I'm kind of like taking my bag of tricks and just dumping them on the table here. What would be most helpful for you guys now? I can do a variety of things. I can start from scratch. I can kind of finish something up. I can answer more questions. I don't know how much time we have.
Maybe you could just do some blending, like show us, now you've shown us like all the different colors and how you overlap them. Maybe you could show us how you use them on something you've got up there.
Okay.
Paint a figure.
Paint a figure.
Paint something.
Okay.
Or work on the picture more, show more blending.
Show more blending. Okay, let me see if I can.
We're gonna take a quick stand-up break.
All right, let's take a quick stand-up break. I'll find some pieces that I can work on.
Stand along the table so we can see what he's doing.
Yeah, I know, it's not the same thing, right?
There's a delay.
How big is the delay?
About couple seconds.
A few seconds?
But it's enough.
You're complaining about a couple seconds.
Hey, I want to thank you.
All right, for anyone who happens to be watching, we'll be right back. We'll give us 5 minutes. BRB.
Are you going to be at C2E2?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
See you there?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah? You're going to be a C2E2?
Every year.
Nice. Same.
Yeah. That's
Are you
Chicago
doing a
C2E2.
demo there or?
C2E2, I don't think so. There's another show in August called Fan Expo Chicago in Rosemont. They have the thing called Comic Explosion where I have an hour to paint something. And I've done that a couple times with
I went
them.
to that one when it was back being called Wizard
Wizard
World.
Wizard World? Oh,
Haven't been
you're a
in
classic
couple
nerd.
years. Yes. Long term.
So she should catch the auction.
Yeah, C2E2, there's an auction that sometimes happens that I donate pieces to.